Okay.
And
So,
the Zoom settings have there's a section for statistics that'll show you how your computer is doing and like the quality of the audio and everything, like the latency and the jitter and
yeah.
packet loss. And have you already looked at that?
No, but I've been getting like little messages saying that like my audio would sound better if I closed down more stuff, but I don't
Yeah.
really have anything open except for like my notes.
Yeah, it's probably just
My
your camera.
my computer was made during the Obama
Oh
administration.
my god. All right, so 2016.
No, like first term.
Oh my god. That's bad, bro.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Should we get into it?
All right, yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. Welcome to your Leftcom Radio Hour. This is the Footnotes and Endnotes podcast. My name is Uri Mark Todoroff.
And my name is Owen Gilbride. Welcome to our very first virtual episode.
Yes, virtual. We are coming to you from the opposite ends of the country, of the continent almost.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we're recording this on October 13th, 2020, which you might know is Canadian Thanksgiving.
Wait, I thought Thanksgiving was yesterday.
Oh, fuck. Oh, oh, God. Oh, no.
Oh, and I celebrated on Sunday.
What am I going to do with all this turkey?
I don't know.
Oh, now I feel like a turkey. Someone should put me in the oven.
Oh, God. Let's stuff you. All right, so we're here to discuss the logic of gender on the separation of spheres and the process of abjection. It's an essay. I would say it's like the second essay in Endnotes number 3. It's the third item on the table of contents, but the editorial does not really count. It's a pretty complex essay, quite difficult to understand. Read through it 2 times. First time on an airplane, second time this morning. And in each case, it was a real slog. Not to like say that it's bad or anything, but it is very difficult to understand. A lot of like conceptual distinctions, a lot of new ideas introduced, very technical, very painful to read. Yeah, how do you rate that personally, I would give it a good 4 hammer and sickle emojis out of 5.
Ooh, 4 hammer and sickle emojis out of 5. Uh, yeah, I'd say that sounds about accurate. I have to take a point off because it is like pretty dense, so I can't give them like the style point, but like I felt like I gained some clarity about the idea of the spears, which is something that when I read Capital for the first time, like I was kind of aware that there was like this sphere of production and the sphere of reproduction, and that one was like related to like work and one was related to the home. But at least in Capital Volume 1, I didn't feel like there was too much in the way that I picked up about like the real mechanics of that relationship, other than just that like home life was pretty dire in Britain in the 1860s.
Right. Yeah, I felt like I also gained some decent understanding of that aspect of Marxism, but specifically the topic of like sex and gender, I feel like it's still kind of mysterious to me. Um, I'm not like quite sure of like what their particular like take on it is, and like how they are, like situating the two as like historically contingent and all that. It's like I feel like
Yeah.
if it were just longer, then they would have had more space to unpack it, and it would have been
Yeah, this is another
easier
one
to
of those
understand.
Endnotes articles that feels like it would be worthy of like a, a much longer piece to like
Yeah,
develop these concepts.
yeah,
But I do feel like they seem to be here addressing sort of, I think, a common like point of contention that maybe like a newcomer might have to a subject like Marxist feminism when they hear something like, "Oh, capitalism creates sex and the gender relation," and the immediate complaint might be like, well, no, that gender's existed for like ever. It's it's biological. But like I think what they're talking about particularly here is how like what capitalism is creating is these social roles, these particular ideas of what these like terms called gender and sex signify, what they represent, and what their so-called natural role in society is, when these natural roles are basically roles that are dictated by capitalism. They're not perennial like aspects of human nature or biology or animality. They're just aspects of capitalist logic playing out at all levels.
right. Even the traditional distinction in like following from Judith Butler between sex and gender, like I feel like it's fairly common, at least, um, for people to understand that gender is more of a social construct, whereas sex is like something biological and refers
Yeah.
to like physiognomy and biology, all of that sort of thing. But like they want to make a very strong claim that both of those things are in fact historically contingent and like socially constructed, that they're the two sides of the same coin, and they draw an analogy between sex and gender and use value and exchange value towards the end of the essay.
Yeah, which I did find interesting. That analogy stood out to me as well because like, insofar as something is a use value, like you buy a commodity hammer and well, it's a hammer. You can certainly use it for actual things in the real world. It has weight, it has form, it can actually like affect changes in a hammerly way, let's say. And obviously hammers predate capitalism.
Right.
But insofar as it is like this commodity use value hammer, it's been given like a particular role in like the social superstructure and like a particular use value. And I think that's what they're talking about here, insofar as they're talking about sex and gender, is that like, well, yeah, there is a certain like physical phenomenon that these things are pointing to, that they're kind of like associating themselves with, but like all of our ways of conceiving about these things in the current paradigm and for the last long while, like hundreds of years, is wholly conditioned by like the system we're in.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Um, it's not so like there. I mean, there has to be a way to speak of difference. Like they at one point get into how like some bodies have a certain organ, the
Mm,
uterus, which
yeah.
allows for them to produce children. So these are like real concrete differences between the bodies that compose the human species. And within a communist utopia, post the communization revolution, we would still need some kind of way to speak of these differences.
Yeah, like they still exist, but like there'd be like there's an infinite exploratory potential for how you interpret these like basic biological phenomena.
Right.
And it's like I think, this is something that kind of came to me as I was reading this, and this is sort of tangentially related to the essay, but I feel like another common complaint that someone would say about like the socialist utopia or the communist utopia is that they would try to eradicate all of these differences between people and create this sort of one faceless drone proletariat with like no gender, no race, no heritage, just like this formless utilitarian drone.
Mm-hmm.
And it got me thinking that like, that's a weird sort of psychological thing, because if anything, that's kind of what happens under like, capitalism. That's what's happened for the last 100 years, or many more years than that. It's just been the creation of this kind of identityless, like global citizen who just wants to participate in the market, and like having access to various forms of hedonistic pleasure is like the primary motivating force. Like
Right.
I was thinking about this particularly in relation to this essay, how when you hear about like scientific developments, like these like attempts by scientists to create, say, like an artificial womb so that you could grow babies in the lab and nobody would have to get pregnant anymore. You could just like grow a baby in a lab. And it's like the primary reason why this is presented as a good thing is because it would allow the people who would normally get pregnant to be able to just work without being hampered by that inconvenience of pregnancy.
Right. And it would like just fully eradicate the like value based difference, the distinction between the two sexes.
I'm going to read this quote from the very first section. But first, at the very introduction, they explain that this article is an attempt to more precisely examine the gender question using systematic dialectic, which, to redefine systematic dialectic, is a method that tries to understand social forms as interconnected moments of a totality, moving from the most abstract categories to the most concrete. So they go on from there in the very first section, which is called production/reproduction, which are the two spheres. And there's a quote here. When Marx speaks of reproduction, he does not refer to the production and reproduction of any commodity in particular. Rather, he is concerned with the reproduction of the social totality. However, when Marxist feminists speak of reproduction, what they often aim to specify is the production and reproduction of the commodity of labor power. This is because in Marx's critique, the relationship between the reproduction of labor power and the reproduction of the capitalist totality is incomplete. Labor power and its bearer are one and the same living person. Labor power is the living, laboring capacity of this person. So right off the bat, they're talking about this thing, labor power, which is in Marxist thought, basically, there's this idea that everyone's participating in the market. Everyone's a capitalist. The difference between the working class and the capitalist class is that the capitalist controls other resources, whereas the only resource that the working class individual has is their labor power, which is their ability to go to work and do some sort of a task that they've been directed to do that they wouldn't necessarily just do for their own enjoyment or their own survival. They have this ability to generate value by doing an activity, by like working land or working in a factory or working in a restaurant or an office or any other sort of labor you could imagine. And the way that the capitalist profits from this is he pays the individual worker for a portion of their working time, but is actually reaping more value than what he's paying for. And he uses this surplus value to bolster his position in capitalist society by buying more resources, hiring even more workers, putting out advertising, etc., etc. So what this essay is about in large part is exploring the reproduction of that commodity of labor power, specifically like where it comes from, which is from the reproductive sphere, which is the sphere of life, which is seen as being outside of the capitalist relationship. It's everything that is ostensibly considered sacred and human and beyond, thoughts of work and business and money and commodity and productivity. But when you look at a society that's largely dominated by these things, inevitably this reproductive sphere, which is ostensibly outside of the capitalist relationship, is entirely controlled by capitalism, just in a more sort of like diffused and occluded manner.
Right. It's controlled because like the reproductive sphere, which is outside of the sphere of like direct value production, is still controlled and ultimately determined by the productive sphere, just because like the productive sphere really sets the terms for all of society. Like you cannot reproduce outside of the terms of value. You still need a wage in order to reproduce yourself. You need to reproduce yourself in a limited amount of time, because you have to go get the wage. Like all of like culture is determined by value. So like the various ways that you're going to reproduce yourself and like your motivation for doing so, all that kind of stuff. Basically, like the reproductive sphere, it's kind of like I imagined it as like some kind of like shell around the productive sphere, but it like encloses it in a way, but it is still like determined by the productive sphere.
Yeah, in a way, it's almost like, imagine you were working somewhere and like, let's say in a factory or something, and they had like a little like smoking area outside where maybe there's like a picnic table and a few potted plants and you can sit out in the sun, you can smoke your cigarette, but you can't just get up and walk away. Like, I mean, you go out for your smoke break and there's this slight feeling of freedom. There's this slight feeling of taking a break from like the grind of your work, but you're still basically at work. And you can think of the reproductive sphere sort of as like a further expansion of the idea of the smoke break, where, okay, the work day's ended. You could go home. You could go out to the bar. You could go visit friends. You could go out for a drive in the country. But the society is structured as such that you're probably going to have to go back to work tomorrow. You're probably going to have to take care of a number of things while you're at home, such as sleeping and eating and, trying to raise your family, which is something that most people would eventually do historically. And even if you want to engage with any of these more extracurricular activities, like say working on an art project or reading books or developing some sort of skill, these things are usually seen in terms of like the possibility of applying them to the market somehow so that you can get a better position in the market, so that you can more effectively act as a capitalist and eventually escape from this relationship. So the reproductive sphere is largely just an attempt to recover from work, to prepare for future work, and to scheme about how you might eventually escape from the cycle of work.
Damn, that is like a really poignant and fucked up picture of how society works. Like all of life is just a smoke break before you have to go back to work.
Basically. I mean, I will say I've been on like a 6 months long smoke break right
some
now.
Some smoke breaks are longer than others.
Yeah, thanks Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really sad. But I guess like what they're talking about specifically is like the topic of this essay is about gender and sex and like quote feminized like reproductive activities. So specifically, we're going to be talking and thinking about the activities that you would be doing on your, extended smoke break that go towards like, producing the family, but it's not even just about the individual family unit. It's about society as a whole.
Just like, if the individual could choose to dedicate all his time to playing video games or any other sort of hedonistic pursuit, but like as a whole, society is required that, a great number of people start families and have children and things like
Right.
that.
Yeah, I mean, the population needs to keep going, and capital needs more workers. So it needs people to keep, having families. It needs, ultimately, it has like condemned women, the female subject, the female portion of the population, to do the lion's share, at least historically and even continuing today, of like reproducing society in a more like general and more like essential sense, just like getting back to the family and like the household.
The second section of this essay is called paid/unpaid, and this is something they do throughout this essay. It's interesting. I don't know if this is like intentional, but we're talking about sex and gender, and most of this essay is presented in terms of like exploring a binary in like different ways of like reframing the same fundamental kind of idea. You have the two spheres. You have the idea of paid and unpaid labor. You have the idea of male and female, waged and unwaged, public, private. Like it continuously comes up as this running theme.
Of binaries.
So yeah. Like the basic concept of the binary.
I guess
like
binaries, they're pretty important to dialectical thought. So maybe that's why, like more meta philosophically, we might suggest that binaries are so prevalent here.
That makes sense. I'm gonna read this quote from the start of the second section. The difference between paid and unpaid on the one side and waged and unwaged on the other is blurred by the form of the wage, by what we must name the wage fetish. The wage itself is not the monetary equivalent to the work performed by the worker who receives it, but rather the price for which a worker sells their labor power, equivalent to a sum of value that goes one way or another into the process of their reproduction, as they must reappear the next day ready and able to work. However, it appears that those who work for a wage have fulfilled their social responsibility for the day once the workday is over. What is not paid for by the wage appears to be a world of non-work. Therefore, all work, in air quotes, appears to be paid tautologically as that which is work, since one does not appear to get paid for that which one does when one is not at work. However, it is imperative to remember that Marx demonstrated that no actual living labor is ever paid for in the form of the wage. So something they go into here is that a distinction that I mentioned earlier is that things in the DMM sphere. I don't know if we've brought up the idea of the DMM sphere and the IMM sphere.
We have not.
Directly marketed. So they have two concepts that they introduce in this essay. They have the DMM sphere, which is the directly market mediated sphere, and the IMM sphere, which is the indirectly market mediated sphere. So the DMM sphere refers more specifically to the workplace, to doing labor when you're on the clock with this eye for maximum efficiency and maximum production and making profit. It is where most explicitly and openly you see capitalist logic. It's wage labor as such. The IMM sphere is everything in the sphere of reproduction. It is home life, and it includes leisure, but it also includes all of those things which are necessary for participating in work, in like, buying your food, eating your food, getting cleaned up, sleeping, starting families, on a more like abstract and total social level. But the IMM sphere, which is all of these other things, many of which are necessary for one's survival and the survival of capitalist society as a whole, does not have directly that same sort of capitalist logic applied to it. It doesn't have that maximization of efficiency and organization and repetition in a formal, structured way. So all of this labor that's carried out in the IMM sphere, and largely by women historically, is made opaque. It's necessary work, but it's not work that's seen as being part of the world of actual work. It's not work you're being paid for.
Basically, the IMM is every type of human activity that is not compensated with a wage, and which is not, communism. Like communist activity would, I feel like it would kind of like fit in, just in the sense that it's not compensated by a wage, obviously. But yeah, indirectly market mediated just basically means everything in human society, any type of human activity that is not compensated by a wage. I feel like this is how we can get at another important distinction that they want to make between natural and, I guess, denatural, not unnatural, but there's like a process of naturalization and denaturalization that occurs historically. And when you think about, women producing families, or it's kind of weird to talk about women producing families, but, like the propagation of the human species and its tendency to become larger over time, which is just like an empirical fact of history, that appears to us as a natural process. And also, I guess like later on, they're going to talk about how like post austerity, there's some process of denaturalization where all of these activities that have like historically been like quote naturally the activities of the female sex or whatever, they become denaturalized in some way.
So this is the directly market-mediated sphere, which is the working sphere where capitalist logic is most readily at play, most obviously. The IMM sphere, the indirectly market-mediated sphere, is everything that's outside formally of that relationship. So home life, leisure time, but also everything that is necessary to reproduce your labor power. So basically everything that you need to do to be happy, well, not happy necessarily, but healthy and able-bodied and able to continue working your job day in and day out for years and years. So this is everything that falls in the IMM sphere. And historically, this is associated with women's work, where if the man was seen as the breadwinner, as the one who would go to work in the coal mine or whatever, the woman was seen as the one who took care of the household duties. And even though these duties are all like essential for the continued production of labor power, which is the foundational value creating locus within capitalist society, it all stems from exploitation of labor power, and the reproduction of this labor power was largely taken care of in the home, largely by women. It was not formally, and is still not formally, recognized as being actual labor because it is not being paid a wage. It is not being done in sort of a formal, structured, like scheduled manner. It's sort of seen as existing within the cracks of wage labor. I mean, obviously, for like the average person living in society, they probably put much more focus and emphasis and like a sense of genuine, like, oh, that's the real me, is the me that's not at work, the me that's at home, that has friends, that has relationships, that has a family, that has hobbies, whatever, dreams, etc., etc. But in the eyes of capitalist logic, it's
Right.
not labor that's being paid a wage. It's not on the clock. So it almost, I don't want to say it doesn't exist, but it's like outside of the official dictums of the machine.
Right. I mean, I think that for capital, it's fair to say that reproductive labor doesn't exist. Like it's not value producing, therefore doesn't really exist within the terms of capitalism. I mean, it's kind of weird to think about. Like the individuals certainly know about families and like the birds and the bees, how human beings are born,
Mm.
and like reproductive labor in all of its many forms. And
And I would have,
they certainly value it in some way themselves, but like
yeah,
those are just individuals wearing character masks. But like capital itself as some kind of like abstract monstrous entity, some kind of like giant vampire that's just like sucking off the entire human
that's like,
population, it just doesn't really exist for them.
um, capitalist logic is this very like dehumanizing kind of machine consciousness that doesn't seem to be contained in any one particular person or class of people, but seems to
Right.
like be this sort of like anthropomorphic like projection upon the total like social class of human beings, uh, which has this effect of basically continuously, as much as possible, either trying to exploit maximum value from things that exist in the world, or if it can't do that, to push them to the side as much as possible, such as all these things like having a child or having leisure time so that you don't go crazy and like kill yourself from working like 90-hour weeks every week.
Right. I think it's important to say here that like the IMM sphere, it's still market mediated. So capital can only really conceive of things directly in terms of value. And because like reproductive activity does not directly produce value, it just like, I guess you would say that it's like provides the necessary conditions for value to be produced in the form of a living human being who can go to work. um, it is still producing value indirectly. So like there's still this kind of the tenuous connection between the two spheres, which you need like other sorts of apparatuses to connect, like the state, for example. I think it's like there's this really great diagram on page 69. Nice.
Oh yeah.
That kind of like illustrates how like the two spheres can overlap in a way. Like you have
Mm,
the directly market mediated sphere, which is the sphere that produces value whether living or dead. It still produces value. It's still compensated by a wage. It's still composed of
mm,
activities that get remunerated with cash or whatever. And then you have the indirectly market mediated sphere, which is everything else. But
mm.
there's like a section, it's a Venn diagram, and the two overlap in some ways. So in Quebec, you have a lot of like daycares, for example,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
is provided by the state, and also just like public education in general,
In
and
general.
like all kinds of things. Like the state provides all kinds of things that perform this activity of reproduction via agents who are paid. So like there's an overlap between the two spheres, but it's mediated by the state, not the market. Although, as we'll see later, post austerity, like there's a move in a lot of these European nations to get rid of that, to
Mm,
like economize by privatizing every sector of society, which just results in the abjection, like the casting off of certain of these activities, so that women are once again forced to pick up the slack.
yeah, yeah, and that's the other major term I think that they introduce in this article beyond the like the IMM DMM distinction is the idea of the abject, which let's see if we have a definition. If you have a good definition of the abject.
I have a definition because I've read a bit of Kristeva. It's just I mean, and they define it in Kristeva's terms in one of the footnotes, but it's just the idea of something that is cast off from something that it was a part of. So a very common and it like in Kristeva's writings, it's often associated with like feelings of disgust and revulsion and horror and all that sort of thing. So like a very visceral example is vomit, which is like part of you in some way. It's in your body, but then you throw up and all this stuff is on the floor and you look at it and you feel horror because it was once a part of you.
That was inside of you a moment ago.
It was once a part of you, but now it is like, it's something abject. It's something foreign and strange and weird.
These things, which historically a lot of the ones associated specifically with the home, like child rearing in large part, were owing to various reasons, which we could get into, associated with being women's work. I mean, probably the most obvious one is that the class of people, let's say, that are delineated by this term woman historically were the ones that had wombs and got pregnant and would carry the baby. So perhaps there was this more sort of natural predilection, and once capitalism started to rise, for that class of people to be the ones that continued taking care of the child, whereas the class of people that did not get pregnant was the ones that became associated with going out and earning a wage. But then we get to the 20th century where there's this sort of like capitalist appropriation of the women's liberation movement, where it becomes like, okay, well, yeah, now everyone can participate in work like a man. Everyone can earn a wage, equal opportunity. You start to see the state step in to try to take care of more of these aspects of reproduction, like providing things like daycare, which, in a certain sense, from capitalist perspective, is all well and good until you have an austerity situation where budget cuts need to be made. And often these things like daycares are the first to go because they are not seen as being essential to maintaining the labor market. Right. And it becomes like this sort of abject aspect of life where it's still necessary to deal with it, to recognize it, to integrate it, but it doesn't really have a place in like this identity that you've been conditioned to accept as like as a value earning member of laboring society. Right. It's just like this excess that you need to deal with that, not part of the capitalist logic. There's a good quote towards the end that maybe it's related to what we're currently saying. If not, I can stick it later on in this recording. Yeah. If many of our mothers and grandmothers were caught in the spear of indirectly market-mediated activities, the problem we face today is different. It is not that we'll have to, quote unquote, go back to the kitchen, if only because we cannot afford it. Our fate, rather, is having to deal with the abject. Contrary to the IMM activities of the past, this abject has already been to a large extent denaturalized. It does not appear to those performing it as some unfortunate natural fate, but more like an extra burden that one must deal with alongside wage labor. And I mean, obviously now, and this is another quote, obviously there are nowadays some men, even a few, who do a considerable part of the abject, such as rearing children, and they get to know what many women experience, that the abject sticks to one's skin. Many of these men, especially when they end up having to do most of the childcare, seem somehow to be undergoing a process of social castration.
The idea is that like the like liberal women's liberation movement, I guess it like backfired in a way, or yeah, I guess you could say that it backfired because It didn't really challenge the terms of like the production of gender and sex by capital, and
Mm,
all it really accomplished was making it seem culturally unnatural that women should be the ones women should be confined to their homes. And like, it was pretty fucked up to learn that in France and Germany up until the 60s and 70s, women
yeah,
needed the permission of their husband to go to the workplace. And
yeah,
even if they did, it wasn't seen as like like a enlightened husband like allowing his woman to be equal, or like some kind of equal opportunity thing. It was seen as like the women need to go to work because they were poor as hell.
yeah. They need that extra money. It's like a shameful, disgraceful thing,
Right.
and that's like
So
not even very far back in
I
history.
know exactly. Is I didn't know that, and it's pretty fucked up. But
Yeah,
and those are in like France and Germany are the two countries cited. So those are like the leading countries of the European Union. But
exactly.
the idea is that's like the liberal women's liberation movement didn't challenge the production of gender, which in Endnotes' terms means the anchoring of one segment of the human population to a particular set of activities. They didn't challenge that like sufficiently, so that all they really accomplished was making it seem unnatural that the
Yeah.
women should be confined like socially. And then like that's where like the society was wound up at the time of austerity, when all of these like social institutions like daycare, for example, had been instituted at the behest, presumably, of the women's liberation movement, had to be rolled back. And then like
Mm,
all you're left up with is like women who earn less money, who are less valuable as vehicles of labor power to the
hmm.
capitalists. So they're like less viable in the marketplace, feeling like they belong in the marketplace,
Mm,
rightfully, obviously, but then also like their family has this extra burden that they have to take on because they earn less money. So they have to like do all this reproductive labor, as well as like have to go to work as well, because like women's integration into the marketplace, I'm assuming, like caused the value of men's labor to go down. So like the man was able to earn
yeah.
less money, so they needed like your average household would need two earners. It's all a pretty fucked up situation, but the moral of the story is that, I mean, obviously we all know this, but you can't do like liberalism. Liberalism is not good enough. You need to do communism.
I think in a liberal paradigm, there's like all of these things that like kind of sound nice on paper, but they don't really challenge the like underlying like substratum of the machine. And because of that, it ends up actually like acting against us. Like I was just thinking as you were talking that to me, this seems somewhat similar to like the various technological innovations, like the labor saving devices that have appeared throughout the last few hundred years during the Industrial Revolution onward, where you have all of these inventions which greatly reduce the amount of human labor that is required to produce like an item. So, like, if it took someone X amount of time to produce a hammer like 200 years ago with all of the technological innovations, then it takes like 1/10 that amount of time to produce the same hammer. And, in theory, that sounds good. Like, oh, we've had all these technological innovations. That means it's going to take us much less time to produce all of these things that we're currently producing. And we'll just have much more time for leisure and for
Sure.
exploring what it means to be human and making art and just like enjoying ourselves.
Very
But the
true.
actual reality, obviously, is that no, you don't free up more time for leisure. You free up more labor for producing even more hammers. And it's the same with like these liberation movements where theoretically, when women are allowed to enter the workforce, it sounds like it could be a good thing. It's like, oh, now you're not being forced to take on this one particular role as like the child rearer and the homemaker. Now you have the freedom to go to work. Oh, this is great. There's going to be more people in the workforce. That means like, many hands makes the work light, or however that expression goes. It sounds theoretically like if your primary motivation is to just like sort of ease the load, a good thing, or to give people more freedom to explore all of their potentialities. But in reality, what it becomes with capitalist logic towards maximizing profit is women are now expected to enter the workforce while also taking care of all of their previous duties. The previous duties are like distance from one's mind. They're seen as being somehow less important or less natural, but still obviously necessary. And like you mentioned, when there's a sudden huge rise in the amount of the supply of workers in the workforce, such as women entering the workforce in large numbers, the real result of this is that the average value of any one laborer goes way down.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's contributed to like the flight of capital across lines, like the whole topic of misery and debt. But I just want to clarify something here, because I feel like we're straying into problematic territory here.
Oh, I think I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that like it's great that women are allowed to work.
No, like
but I don't know. Like at this, I mean, it's not really my place as a cis man to say whether or not women are in a better position now than they were like mid-century in France and Germany when they needed their husband's permission to go to work. I mean, like the feminists could argue against you and me by saying that, like austerity has cut back all of these the overlapping of the IMM and the DMM, like all these like state-run daycares and whatnot. So we shouldn't be saying that it should be women who are taking on the burden of the abject like activities of reproduction, but men should be sharing them as well. Like that is an argument that the feminists should make. At some point they get into how like the female sex is like going to be less valuable than the male sex to capital just because of its reliability, because the uterus is essentially a liability to capital.
Because if you get pregnant, you're not going to be able to work for months and months.
Right. I mean, there's like cultural factors at play, like sexism and patriarchy and whatnot.
Yeah.
But there are also like more, I guess, objective, like formal distinctions at play between the two sexes. But
yeah, well, I feel like I should clarify that, like, when I raise these complaints, it's not so much about like what has been given to a particular segment of the population, like historically, such as like women's liberation. Like, no, that's definitely not the complaint. The complaint is rather like recognizing what is continuously being taken away from the population as a whole, men and women, like, and that's like everything that exists outside of the capitalist relationship. All of these other aspects of human life are increasingly just seen as like an unnatural and like something to be minimized as much as possible in terms of its necessity in your own life. That's what's being like continuously taken away. Like I'm not saying it's a bad thing by any means to be free to work or to have any sort of lifestyle you want, but like I'm viewing it from a personal perspective that I want to have access to all of those other things which are seen as existing in the IMM sphere as outside of the capitalist relationship. Like all of these other aspects of human life, like the reproduction of human life. that you do in your so-called free time. From my perspective, those things should be the main focus, and more of life should take place in that sphere of like, yeah, I mean, I feel like right now I'm not speaking so much as like this particular ego identity, but like as a member of society in general, and like what the idea of having children represents to me, like that sort of like communal focus where the primary focus of life is on like the continual like reproduction of human life in sort of a holistic and like naturalized manner.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's kind of like more of an abstract signifier. I'm not like so much talking about like myself in particular as just like, you know, the idea of living a human life.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think post-revolution, post-communization, there's a lot more activities will be integrated into. I mean, obviously, like these two spheres will be annihilated, so this doesn't really like even bear talking about really. But I think a lot more of the activities that you and I personally, as individuals, feel drawn towards will have like a, I don't know, they'll be more important. Like I could see both of us being like teachers, or like in some way like having something to do with like permaculture or something. I don't know. And like in a post-communist society, like the production of food would have, I think, be done significantly different, obviously, but I think that like individualized, or like at least a smaller scale food production is going to be a lot more important to reproducing the human species, you know. I stop, and then you can plug it. Okay.
Okay, you're chopping a lot again.
All right. Thank you for listening to the Footnotes to Endnotes podcast. Will continue to be Uriah Mark Todoroff. You can find me on Twitter at the inverted form. My website is umt.world. Where you find this website. I mean, this podcast, sorry. And my co-host is Mr.
Owen Gilbride here in Montreal, Quebec. If you live in Montreal, Quebec, come find me. We can hang out. My website is world3.tk. I don't know if you're talking right now, Mark, but the internet is really bad because it's being powered by a hamster running in a wheel in the corner of the room. I'm going to try to upgrade my internet connection by next week so that we can record proper. And I'm going to continue working on my fake Wisconsin accent so that I can maintain it throughout the podcast. Anyway, until next week, folks, take care. Please keep drinking old Milwaukee and eating bags of cheese curds, driving Harley Davidson motorcycles.